Those a lot of, oh, okay. Um, so in some of the videos, there is going to be forms of violence, death. There's going to be suicide conversation. There's going to be police officers working with someone that is suicidal. So if you have any triggers surrounding those types of topics, I would just advise you maybe to go get a drink or turn off your screen and audio for those couple of minutes while the videos are playing. Before I get started, does anyone have any questions for me? Okay. So first, who is a first responder? A first responder is a firefighter, a police officer, a paramedic, or an EMT. And after COVID, nurses, doctors, and hospital staff were included in and being recognized as now first responders are on the front lines. So this statistic is a little bit old, but I couldn't find an accurate one for our current year. As of 2018, in the state of Alabama, we had 5,680 firemen, 10,420 policemen, 854 EMTs, and 80 paramedics. That paramedic number is not going to be accurate because firemen can also double up and double dip into that role. And there is a lot of private paramedic businesses throughout the state of Alabama, and they don't always report to the same bureau with their numbers. So that number is probably actually a little bit higher. So, first responder culture. The role of first responder is to help others. So strength, bravery, grit, they're all highly valued, and first responders often take on what is called a whatever it takes mentality. So sometimes this can mean that they go above and beyond what we think someone should do. Sometimes it means they are in the gray area of what we would say is, black or white rules. But they take on this mentality kind of they need to do whatever it takes to get the job done. So first responders are basically experiencing traumatic events in a day in and day out environment. They're constantly being exposed to terrible things that most people would never imagine or witness. And then they have to work amongst that chaos and try to save as many lives as possible. So the norm for a first responder has been to bury those experiences and memories as far down as possible and act like they aren't affected by what they witness every day. This has a purpose, it has a role. It actually helps them continue their job. If they weren't able to stuff down their reactions, stuff down their emotions in what they are seeing in the moment, they wouldn't be able to continue to the job that they're doing. So it is a skill that actually is maladaptive once they're done with their day. Does that make sense to everyone? Anyone have questions about that? Okay. So within the first responder community, there's also this existence of an us versus them mentality. So because cops, firefighters, medics, they work really long shifts and they often work together, they tend to create really strong friendships within their peers, and they tend to then isolate themselves from outside relationships, which really strengthens this us versus them bond. It's a brotherhood that becomes a source of protection from the physical portion of the job. So the person that you're riding with, or the person that's your partner in something, they are protecting you physically. They are your emotional soundboard. It strengthens this bond that it's you and your partner versus the rest of the world, whether it's media, people that are getting in the way, or people that you're talking to about your work. It's still an us versus them mentality that allows them just to feel like I'm with people that get it and everyone else doesn't. And this does shape a lot of what they're willing to share when they come in for mental health services, because if they feel like you're part of the them mentality, they're not going to open up. They're not going to be willing to work on their mental health. And they're not going to trust you with maybe some of the trauma that they have experienced. So trying to focus on this us versus them mentality is probably the first step in building rapport to make sure that you are part of what they consider their team. So first responders also often feel they cannot talk to anyone other than their first responder partners about job stress, like I said. And that means that there's this stigma associated between the job, the culture of it, and then bringing in outsiders. And because of this stigma, the culture basically maintains it, that mental health and problems with mental health are a sign of weakness and failure, and bringing outsiders in is something you just don't do. So over time, this culture instills those same practices and habits into people without any knowledge really of maybe even where it began, but it's because it's what's always been done. So you'll notice that if you do work with first responders, a lot of them will say, well, this is what I was told to do. This is how it's always been done. This is something that I don't question because it came from my higher up. It's just what's in the rules. They live by this mentality of, you just follow what's always been done. Change is not always necessarily seen as a good thing. And so it's also hard sometimes for first responders to adapt to a lot of changes when it comes to the rule book, or in letting other people in. So another part of the culture of first responders is seeing just the idea of the fact that these are individuals where their survival relies upon one another, and they're always constantly putting themselves at risk every day in their community. So it's a tough job, and the perception that they carry is that it's their tough job to perform. So they need to be strong. If they appear weak, if they don't think that they're invincible, it's seen as a detriment to themselves. So a lot of the time when you're working with veterans and first responders, you'll hear them say things like, if I don't do this, then I am weak. If I am not strong, then I'm a failure. If I'm not showing people kind of this macho traditional male values and roles, then I'm not good enough for the job. So those are very common thoughts that come across when working with first responders, and also thoughts that get in the way of helping them understand some of the trauma or some of the stuck points that are getting in the way of either their anxiety or the depression that they're experiencing. Basically, the whole goal of first responder culture is to protect one another, appear strong, and rely on those that you can trust, and those that are in the trust circle are other first responders. Does anyone have any questions about anything that I went over currently? No? Okay. So another important part about working with first responders is understanding trauma. I have a video from the National Center for PTSD that goes over what PTSD is, and we can watch it together if you all would like. But basically, it goes over the symptoms and the criteria and gives an example of what PTSD does look like for an individual. Trauma is basically a shocking or unexpected incident where you have threat to your life. It has a profound disruption on your psychological well-being, and it goes against like social expectations. So you can either witness or be a part of a trauma incident, or you can have the responsibility of the life or the person involved of the trauma incident. First responders typically fall under that last category, where they have responsibility of the life or the person involved. I'm going to skip this little video. So when a first responder comes in, a lot of the time they will talk about how they have difficulty with connecting, difficulty with understanding like the empathy piece, or why when they shove things down, it doesn't really stay there. And once again, those thoughts of, well, if I show emotion, then that's a weakness. If I allow myself to think about it, that's a weakness. So when someone first comes into your room and you're really trying to build rapport, you want to also bring up the idea of what a normal response to trauma is and really normalize that experience for them. So normal expectations are listed there with reactive depression, shock, denial, anger. Anger is a big one. So statistically, men are more likely to show depression with forms of anger. Anger is a secondary emotion. It's an emotion you feel in response to something. So it's the go-to emotion that most men know what it feels like, how to express it, how to deal with it. They're comfortable with anger. They're not comfortable with shame, guilt, vulnerability, sadness or humiliation. So they're going to jump to that one and say, I feel angry all the time, or I'm more irritable and I don't know why. So explaining why even anger is a normal reaction and what it looks like can even help them realize, you know what? Oh, this is okay. This is a reaction to what I'm experiencing. And it does mean that I am connected in some way. So the other ones listed there, guilt, blame, grief, hypervigilance, all of those I would encourage you to give a little bit of psychoeducation on if they don't feel like they understand what that could look like. Usually you want to just kind of go with what you're seeing in your assessment. Common ones I see more often than not are the hypervigilance, the guilt, and sleep disturbance and nightmares. Okay, so this is where that trigger warning comes in. I am going to play some videos for you. One is a school shooting that recently happened, and another is a TikTok video of a veteran meeting with a police officer while he's on a suicide hotline. So if you need to now, I would step away from the computer, okay?
Thanks for watching our YouTube.
Go back. Okay, so this is gonna try to play it again. When you are watching that video, I would like to see what people's reactions were before I have you go through it again after I give you some educational pieces on anxiety. What was your initial reaction? What did you notice about the first responders in those videos? Okay, that's okay. So typically when people are watching videos like that, we are not necessarily focused on what the first responder might be feeling or what the first responder might be processing. We're focused on what is happening. We're focused on the fact that there was another shooting in a school, that there was loss of life, that it was a little bit chaotic. But as a first responder helper, your goal is to take the balcony perspective of what the first responder is experiencing. So part of that is going to be what is called different types of anxiety. So you have reactionary anxiety and sorry, I'm going to skip this because it just jumped around, and anticipatory anxiety. So have you all ever played musical chairs where you had to kind of walk around, follow somebody, and then when the music stopped, you had to go grab your chair and take a seat? That is the example I would use for the two different types of anxiety. So as you're walking, you're experiencing anticipatory anxiety because you're not sure when you're going to have to react, but you know you're going to have to. Then something happens and you transition into reactionary anxiety. And that continues on until you feel safe, until you're in that chair that you need. So first responders, specifically on a call like the one we just watched, they are in a constant state of anticipatory anxiety. And then they jump into that reactionary anxiety when they have to take action, like taking shots or are under fire and have to protect themselves or take a life. They do this so often on multiple calls, maybe once a week, maybe once a month, sometimes day to day, depending on where you're living, that it becomes normal for them. So that anticipatory anxiety is a normal way of being for their bodies. And that reactionary anxiety is what they would maybe call like their actual anxiety. So for them, biologically feeling elevated, feeling that, when's the music going to stop? When do I need to run and get my chair? That is their day-to-day life experience. So when you're watching that video, them clearing the rooms, going up the stairs, they're in that anticipatory anxiety. And then when you see them confronting the shooter, that would be the reactionary anxiety, where they're taking it up just another step. So I'm also going to have you watch one more video now that we've kind of talked and explored a little bit about the difference. And then afterwards, if anyone is comfortable, I'd like someone else to point out whether they saw anticipatory anxiety or reactionary. So this one is actually on a TikTok. So
Kylie, I'm not sure if you can see it, but a couple people did put in the chat their reactions. But
oh,
sometimes it's hard
no, I did not, because then you
Yeah.
all will see it.
You
Okay,
want me
hold
to
on.
do you want me to read them to you? Because you may not be able to see with it being the screen.
Okay, seems so normal. Yes. So, okay. I'll make sure I pay attention to whether or not I see that pop up. But if I am ignoring you, I'm sorry. Just let me know that I am. Okay, so here is the next video. Like I said, if you are going to be triggered by potential violence or suicide talk, please mute your audio for the next minute and 9 seconds.
Hey, I got you, man, all right? What race you in? Army? Hey, my name's Kyle. All right, we'll help you out, all right, bud? I'm here with you. I'm here with you, all right? I'm gonna start an ambulance over here to us, okay? All right, bud? Hey, no, hey. If I send you, it's nothing on you, okay? State of Connecticut covers that. All right? Can you step out of the car, boss? Just so we can talk? Cover the front of your truck, bud. Started an ambulance to 6-8 off ramp eastbound. I'm with the fat. We'll talk to you guys soon. Hey, anything on you? Okay, is that our check-in? Cool. Any deployment funds? What? Tough time for everyone in your position, all right? Relax, though. Hey, I'm here with you, okay?
Okay, so I showed that example of another experience that a first responder might go through, because sometimes it's not necessarily that they are going through traumatic calls that we would see as like violence. Sometimes it's helping other people, but it's traumatic because they're helping people through something very difficult like suicide, and they're making other connections. The police officer that actually posted that TikTok is another veteran, and he goes on in other TikToks to explain that it's harder for him when he takes those calls because he feels more connected to them. Like I said, it goes back to that us versus them mentality. He sees that person as part of his group, part of his people. So he reacts more strongly to those situations. He's happy to go on those calls and be a part of that solution, but he does have a stronger reaction than maybe someone that isn't tied to the military. The anxiety that we would probably place that example under is anticipatory. So that whole time he is probably experiencing anticipatory anxiety of what's going to happen next. Is this person going to hear me out? Is he actually going to do anything to harm himself? What kind of objects does he have in his car that could potentially harm him or me? And when he came out of the car, then the cop had to do a reactionary piece where he was going to be patting him down and then transition back into anticipatory. So you saw a little bit of movement in the different types of anxiety and preparedness that the police officer would be taking in that scenario. And like I said, once again, this is a day in and day out activity for them. So this level of anxiety is something that is normalized. And so over time, biologically, that's going to feel normal in the body. So, they're not really going to even notice when they are doing more elevated activities per se, just because they're always elevated in a day-to-day, job stress. So, did anyone have any comments or questions before I move on about that video? And I'll make sure I double check here for the chat. Okay. And this, hopefully we can skip. Okay. So how trauma impacts first responders, it's got two pieces. So biologically, their blood sugar levels increase, their sweat glands perspire, their eyes dilate, their heart rate increases, their mouth can become dry. The blood actually decreases in their arms and legs and pulls more towards their major organs in the head and trunk. So imagine that going on every single day. Biologically, your body is doing all of these different steps while you're in that anticipatory anxiety stage, and how exhausting that probably is on you physically. When you add that into what they're actually witnessing, it's no wonder that mental health wise, they tend to have negative outcomes. So police officers and firefighters are more likely to die by suicide in the line of duty. It's more common, and especially in the last few years, that firemen specifically die by suicide than actually fighting fire. So they're more often to take their life than lose their life in the very dangerous job they do. 85% of first responders have experienced symptoms related to mental health conditions, but 50% of them or higher won't actually seek help because of the fear and the stigma in their culture. And more than 40% of them are actually fearful that they will be fired or demoted or put on desk duty. So although 85% of them are experiencing some form of mental health, they don't get the help they need because of the culture that they're in. So depression and PTSD are 5 times more common in first responders. So when working with first responders, this is probably the first step to do with assessment, rule out depression and PTSD, just because it is more common to see that. Let me make sure I got all of the other stats I wanted to give you all. First responders actually do believe in treatment. When you look at the polls and questionnaires that have been asked around, a lot of them actually do support mental health work, but they do believe that professionally it's risky. So despite having this belief that mental health support and going to therapy is a good idea, they still won't take it because at the end of the day, the job is the priority. A lot of them too will tell you that if they had to pick between their passion and their mental health, they would still pick their passion. Because if there's a chance that their mental health or going to see someone for help is going to take away the one thing that makes them feel alive and useful and like a man or like a woman, depending on if you're working with a female officer, or like they have meaning in their life, they're not going to risk the chance that it's going to be taken away. Okay, so here is my spiel. And the one thing that I would really like everyone to take away, if you do take away one thing from today, is that as a helper, we have a responsibility to our clients to know ourselves. So you are a tool in a helper situation, and you can not help, and you can actually harm a client if you do not know your own limitations and triggers. So working with first responders, there is a lot of political pieces. There's a lot of media attention. There's a lot of stigma with even just what being a police officer is in our society. And all of that has to be checked at the door. You cannot bring in those pieces from your perspective into a therapeutic room because it's already hard enough for first responders to ask for help and even walk through that door. But because of that us versus them mentality, if you were to bring in some of that or any biases that kind of highlight that us versus them, they're not coming back. And even if they come back for their second appointment, they're going to push you and test you to find out whether or not you're going to allow those things in the room, and then they're not coming back. So first responders really do rely heavily on that us versus them mentality, as whether or not to evaluate a helper is in the right position to actually help them. So keeping mindful of your own values, beliefs, political beliefs, and knowing that you're not there to, you know, have those kinds of conversations. You're not there to maybe even change their mind or point out errors or anything like that. You are there for the person in the room. And the person in the room is there to discuss their trauma, to have their side of the story told. So just always kind of check yourself and what you are bringing into the room as a person. The other things that we're working with a first responder is being comfortable with the types of trauma that they're going to be sharing. A lot of first responders that like to do the testing will tell you some of their, what I would say, more disturbing traumatic experiences right out the gate to see if you can handle it, to see if you're going to react and show it on your face, to see if you're going to cry, to see if they can shock you a little bit. So if you do have triggers or strong values and beliefs about school shootings, child-related deaths, forms of violence that you know you're going to have some transference around, I wouldn't recommend working with first responders. Because, like I said, you are the tool in the room. It's not about you, it's about the person that's coming in that is already reluctant to be there. So just kind of being aware of all of those pieces that maybe you have a little more strong reaction to, maybe that you would have some countertransference with, and either working through those things before working with first responders, or just acknowledging that it's not the right population for you. The other part of that is acknowledging if you're going to work with first responders, you are going to hear complex trauma. And I work with first responders every single day. So every single day I am hearing about a child that died, domestic violence, sexual assault, murder, suicide, gun violence. It's heavy. And if that is not something that you feel like you want to carry or hear or are able to hear on a regular basis, first responder work is also not for you. And I'm not saying this in a way where of judgment, but more in an educational piece of knowing yourself and knowing your limitations. And it's okay to have those limitations, because the perfect person that can work with sexual assault, the perfect person that works with mood disorders or severe mental illness may or may not also fit the same role for other areas of mental health. Everyone kind of knows their niche at some point, but when working with first responders, there's layers to it. So we want to make sure that we're able to best serve that community by knowing who we are as a person and what we are bringing into the room and what we can check at the door. The other thing I like to remind people when working with first responders is being comfortable with the idea that there is a lack of control in the world and a lack of control in trauma. If you like to have a lot of control and you like to emphasize on those pieces when you're providing help or therapy, working with first responders is also probably not the right fit for you, because a lot of their work does come from a lack of control. So that's just something to keep in mind and be mindful of as well. Okay. So first responders, like I said, typically have forms of depression or PTSD. There's a couple evidence-based treatments for responders: cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, and EMDR. EMDR is one I feel like people have heard about the most. Prolonged exposure has started to become like a virtual reality piece, and they're doing that at the VA. And then cognitive processing is under the CBT umbrella. I will also share, I'm very biased towards this because I am a certified provider with cognitive processing therapy, which is why I have that video of what cognitive processing therapy is that we'll watch in just a second. But all three of these do have a lot of studies behind them of being effective, of working with the type of trauma that responders experience. Typically, people see relief within anywhere between 5 to 12 sessions. So this type of treatment is kind of the go-to standard for working with first responders. One thing I do like about cognitive processing is it's a tool that you can use beyond trauma. So I use it for depression, I use it for anxiety, I use it just for solution focused types of issues, because it fits in a way that allows you to be a little bit flexible. And it's just something that, like I said, it's under that CBT umbrella. So it can kind of be tied into other little pieces, whereas EMDR and prolonged exposure, from an evidence point of view, are more geared towards just trauma. So I'm going to play the video for cognitive processing therapy just so y'all are aware of what it is. Oh,
A traumatic event can change the way you think about yourself and the world. You might think you're to blame for what happened, or believe you don't deserve to be happy. You may start to believe the world is unsafe. Doing things like going to a grocery store or restaurant may seem too dangerous. These kinds of thoughts are common in people with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. They're called stuck points. They keep you stuck in your PTSD and cause you to miss out on the people, places, or activities you used to enjoy. So how do you get unstuck? Cognitive processing therapy, or CPT, is a PTSD treatment that can help you break the negative thinking that's holding you back. It's based on the idea that our thoughts affect how we feel and how we act. In CPT, you and your therapist will talk about how your negative thoughts about the trauma, those stuck points, have changed you, how safe and in control you feel, how much you trust yourself and others, and even your sense of self-worth. You'll practice a strategy to change or challenge your stuck points. PTSD can make you jump to negative conclusions, but there may be other ways to think about things that are more accurate and less upsetting. Imagine you're driving down the highway and someone swerves in front of you. You might blow up at the driver. What a jerk. But what if he was racing to the hospital or having a panic attack and rushing to get off the road? If you consider these possibilities, you might not feel as angry. The bottom line, small changes in thinking can have a big impact on how you feel. Some people find that writing about their trauma helps them change upsetting thoughts and feelings. You and your therapist can decide whether or not this is right for you. CPT works just as well either way. You can also choose to meet with your therapist one-on-one or in a group with others who have PTSD. CPT is evidence-based, meaning it's been shown to work in multiple research studies, and it doesn't take years. In fact, CPT usually takes about 3 months of weekly visits. CPT can help you get unstuck, bring you up to start enjoying the things you've been missing out on. Men and women, veterans and civilians can all benefit from CPT. If cognitive processing therapy sounds like it could be right for you, talk to your doctor about finding a CPT provider, or visit the National Center for PTSD website at www.ptsd.va.gov to learn more about CPT and other PTSD treatments. No matter how long you've been living with PTSD, know that you can get better.
Okay. So some other little tips and tricks if you decide that working with first responders is something you want to do. I encourage you to speak the language. So what that means is understanding chain of command, understanding some of their acronyms, understanding how shift changes work, what night shift means, what day shift means. Basically, not having to take up time when you are helping them or doing therapeutic sessions, and having them teach you and having them explain things to you. The session is not for you, it's for them. So if you can take out that part, it's actually really helpful, and also helps you build into, like I said, that mentality of us versus them. Now you're in the trust circle. You get it. You can speak the language. Something that helps with this is going on a ride along. You do, with COVID, they weren't really allowing this, but it is something that has come back up. You just have to talk to your local precincts or your fire stations. Sometimes EMTs even let you ride along. You just have to get permission and sign consent forms. As always, completing trainings that are specifically geared towards working with first responders. Like I said, those evidence-based trauma treatments are really good. EMDR, prolonged exposure, CPT, and just making sure that you are preparing yourself with tools that are going to best fit the client. Being comfortable with the uncomfortable. If you're not someone that is okay sitting with someone on their worst day or having to feel uncomfortable internally but not showing that externally, I would think about whether or not this working with first responders is the right fit. Flexibility with your schedule. First responder schedules, like I said, they have a night shift and a day shift. They also tend to work either 3 days on or 3 days off, or 4 days on and 4 days off. So they are not going to be a client that is consistently coming in on the same day at the same time every single week. Sometimes even when they schedule appointments, they have to work overtime unexpectedly, or they're involved in an incident, which means that they're not going to be able to come in. This means that they might not be able to cancel. It means that they might cancel last minute. And there does need to be a little bit of flexibility with that, and lack of frustration on our part, because it's not something that they can always be in control of. Another piece of working with first responders is comfort with their language in the room and humor. So something I like to highlight is a lot of first responders cope with dark humor. And I emphasize cope with, because they're not using it to necessarily upset you or disrespect you. They're using it as a coping mechanism. They like to make jokes to make light of the situation. It allows them to take a step back and not necessarily be as involved in whatever they're making the joke with. It allows them to have that space so they don't feel like they have to carry it. It allows them to keep doing their jobs. So you'll notice a lot of first responders have very dark humor. That language wise, I've come across a lot of, like I would say cursing. I just call it like macho language basically. But being comfortable with those pieces and not trying to force them to change some of that unless it is actually disrespectful. It's just kind of one of those things that you do have to navigate with your own comfort level, but it is something to be mindful of, that it is a way for them to cope and for them to also build that sense of community of who gets it. Another really important part about working with first responders, because it is so trauma heavy, it is knowing and managing your own self-care. I'm sure this has probably been preached a lot to all of y'all if you are helpers, but having a self-care routine is very important. So knowing what helps you relax intentionally at the end of the day, knowing what helps lift up your mood and makes you feel like you're filling your own cup up, and doing those things regularly allows you to keep doing this kind of heavy work. And also it's just a good way of practicing what you preach, basically, because you are going to be encouraging these first responders to have self-care themselves. So we kind of need to make sure that we're doing it on our end as well. And now I'd like to open it up for any questions or thoughts or any clarification anyone needs on anything I shared. Are we okay on time, Faith?
We are perfect on time. It's 12:46.
Okay.
So I will ask a question, especially considering a lot of the people in this group, I believe, are doing a lot of work on an advocacy basis.
Okay.
What is something that you would say would be kind of a way to get your foot in the door with local law enforcement agency, firefighters, any first responders, if maybe you're new to the area or your organization has not had a chance quite yet to make those connections so that they know you're available?
So from an advocacy role, I would encourage meeting the first responders. So going to any trainings that the first responders are holding in their precincts or fire stations. Sometimes they do open it up to the public to attend certain things. I know I've attended a lot of the Auburn Police Department's like CEUs. That way you're with them in the room. You can get to know them. They know your name. You share what organization you're from. I'd also encourage those ride-alongs to get into that circle of trust, any exposure is going to be good, because then they'll say, okay, well, they get it, or they understand, or they're trying to, and then they'll be more willing to engage, and probably engage in a positive way. That language piece, like learning more about their language, chain of command, their acronyms, that also makes it a lot easier. There is actual like little YouTube videos that you can watch if you wanted to learn some of those pieces. So I would watch some of those. There's also usually, gosh, I forget the name of what it's called, but each county offers it, and it's like a citizen school. And if you wanted to attend something like that, one, you're gonna get to learn different like rules and things for your county, but you'll also get to connect with all different types of first responders in the community, and then they'll also know about your resource, because you'll be there.